The betting pool in the Iron Ridge barracks had hit $4,000 by the second hour of the blizzard. The enforcers, men built of thick muscle and thicker cruelty, sat around a flickering television, tossing crumpled 20s onto a grease-stained table. They weren't betting on a football game. They were betting on how many minutes it would take for Elara's lungs to crystallize. They were betting on her heart slowing to a rhythmic thud before finally surrendering to the permafrost. When the pack threw her out into the white hell of a Wyoming January, they weren't just exiling her. They were hosting a televised execution where nature was the executioner. Elara was the Omega, the clutter of the pack, a girl whose only inheritance was a name that meant nothing, and a spirit they had spent 22 years trying to break. As she walked toward the northern perimeter, her thin sneakers sinking into the drifts, she heard the laughter from the great hall. They had given her a roofless, rotted ruin at the edge of the world, and called it mercy. But the Iron Ridge forgot the first rule of the wild. The harshest winters create the strongest wolves. The atmosphere inside the Iron Ridge Great Hall was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Outside, the Wyoming winter was howling, slamming gale-force winds against the heavy oak doors, but inside, the atmosphere was even colder. Elara stood in the center of the room, her head bowed. She was 22, but malnutrition and years of sleeping in the drafty, unheated attic of the pack house made her look like a child. She wore a faded gray hoodie that had belonged to a previous pack member 3 years ago. The cuffs were frayed and unraveling, and the fabric was so thin it offered no protection against the draft. Varric, the beta, paced back and forth. He was a massive man, built like a main battle tank, with a buzz cut and eyes that held zero sympathy. He stopped directly in front of Elara, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Do you have any idea how much that meat cost?" Varric's voice was a low growl that vibrated in Elara's chest. That was venison A5, imported from the coastal preserves for the Alpha's return feast. It was meant to symbolize our wealth to the visiting dignitaries. And you clumsy, useless waste of space, you burned it. "I didn't," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. "The stove, the pilot light malfunctioned." "I tried to tell the kitchen staff 3 days ago that the regulator was sticking." "Lies!" Varric roared, the sound echoing off the high rafters. A few pack members lounging by the fire snickered. They loved the show. It was a diversion from the boredom of the storm. "Always excuses with you, Elara. You're an Omega. Your only job is to stay out of the way and do what you're told. And you can't even manage to flip a steak without ruining it." Elara bit her lip until she tasted iron. It hadn't been an accident. She had seen Sloane, one of the high-ranking Gamma females, turn the gas up to a searing high when Elara had stepped into the pantry to fetch the garnish. Sloane had wanted to see Elara punished simply because she was bored, and in the hierarchy of the ridge, the word of an Omega was worth less than the dirt on an enforcer's boots. "Alpha Caelum will be home in 2 days, Varric sneered, using the leader's first name to emphasize his own temporary authority, while Caelum was away on pack business in Chicago. "I will not have his house smelling of burnt failure. I've made a decision. You are stripped of your room in the attic. You are stripped of your kitchen duties." "Please, Beta Varric," Elara stammered, panic flaring. "I can scrub the floors. I can work double shifts in the laundry. I'll fix it." "You can't fix what you are," Varric said coldly. He pointed toward the heavy doors. "There's the old trapper's hut on the northern perimeter. It's still on pack land, so technically we aren't violating the ancient code by banishing you completely. But you are no longer welcome under this roof. You want to eat? You forage. You want warmth? You make a fire." A murmur went through the room. Someone whispered in the back, "That thing hasn't had a roof since the storm of '98. It's a grave." "Go," Varric barked, "before I have the enforcers drag you out by your hair." Elara didn't pack a bag because she had nothing to pack. She walked out of the heavy oak doors and into the biting wind. The snow was falling horizontally, stinging her face like tiny needles. The pack house, a sprawling mansion of timber and stone, glowed warmly behind her. Through the high windows, she could see them, her family, returning to their drinks, the drama of her life already forgotten. The walk to the northern perimeter took 3 hours. By the second hour, Elara's feet were numb blocks of ice. The wind cut through her thin hoodie as if she were naked. She kept moving only because the wolf spirit deep inside her, weak, dormant, and starved, pushed her forward. "Move or die," it whispered. "Move or die." She crested the final hill and saw it. Varric hadn't lied. It was a ruin. The old trapper's hut was a rotting carcass of wood and stone. 2 walls had partially collapsed, and the roof was a gaping mouth open to the sky. Snow had piled up inside, waist deep in the corners. It wasn't a shelter. It was a wind tunnel. Elara fell to her knees in the snow, her body shaking so violently her teeth clattered together. This was how it ended. Not in a glorious battle, but freezing to death in a pile of rotting cedar because a gamma female thought it would be funny to ruin a roast. She crawled inside the structure, seeking the corner where the walls were still highest. She curled into a ball, trying to preserve whatever body heat she had left. As her consciousness began to drift toward the gray sleep of hypothermia, a strange sound caught her ear. It wasn't the wind. Drip, drip, hiss. It was faint, coming from beneath the debris in the far corner of the hut. Water. In this temperature, water didn't drip. It froze instantly. Elara forced her eyes open. She dragged her numb body across the frozen dirt floor. She pushed aside a rotted wooden plank and a pile of wet leaves. There, coming from a crack in the stone foundation, was a tiny wisp of steam. She reached out a shaking hand and touched the stone. It was warm. Elara blinked, thinking she was hallucinating. But the warmth against her fingertips was shocking, like touching a live wire. She dug frantically at the debris, her fingernails breaking against the frozen earth. The hut was built against the side of a rocky incline, and as she cleared away the rotting timber, she found the source. An old iron pipe, rusted and ancient, protruding from the rock face. It wasn't just warm, it was hot. Elara realized what this was. The ridge territory was known for its geothermal activity. Hot springs were scattered deep in the mountains, but no one knew a vein ran this far out to the perimeter. This pipe must have been part of an old heating system the trapper used a century ago. "I can work with this," Elara whispered. The despair that had crushed her in the great hall evaporated, replaced by a white-hot determination. They wanted her to die. She would spite them by living. The first night was brutal, but Elara survived by curling around the warm pipe. When dawn broke, leaving the world brilliant and blindingly white, she didn't rest. She knew she had to make this place habitable before the next wave of the storm hit. She spent the morning scavenging. She found that the ruin wasn't as hopeless as it looked. The stone foundation was solid, and the wood that had collapsed was rot-resistant cedar. She remembered an old maintenance shed about a mile back toward the main house, a place where the groundskeepers dumped broken equipment. Keeping to the tree line to avoid being seen by border patrols, she struck gold. In the rusted dumpster behind the shed, she found a shovel with a cracked handle, a heavy-duty blue tarp with only a few small holes, and a discarded toolbox containing a rusty hammer, some nails, and a heavy-duty staple gun. To the pack, this was trash. To Elara, it was a treasury. For the next 3 days, Elara worked until her hands bled. She was an Omega, and while she lacked the raw physical power of an Alpha, she possessed something they didn't: endurance. She used the tarp, doubling it over and nailing it across the most sheltered corner of the hut, creating a wind-proof room inside the stone walls. She reinforced it with pine boughs, weaving them together tight enough to catch the snow, which would then act as a natural insulator. Inside her little tent, the heat from the geothermal pipe was trapped. By the 3rd night, the temperature inside her enclosure was hovering around 60 degrees, while outside it was 10 below zero. She spent hours scrubbing the stone floor with snow and sand until the grime of decades was gone. She wove a sleeping mat out of dried cattails and pine needles, a trick she had read about in an old survival book in the pack library. On the fourth day, she found a loose stone in the chimney. Behind it was a cash box left by a trapper 50 years ago, matches, a hunting knife, and a stash of dried herbs, sage, lavender, and chamomile. By the end of the week, the ruin had transformed. From the outside, it still looked like a pile of debris, a perfect camouflage. But inside, it was a sanctuary. She had fashioned a small basin from a hollowed-out stone to catch the hot water, giving her a place to wash with steaming water. A luxury even the lower-ranking wolves in the pack house didn't have. She sat on her mat sipping pine needle tea. She was safe. She was warm. And then the wind changed. Down in the valley, Alpha Caelum threw his coat onto his leather couch. He was 6'3", with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was exhausted. The negotiations in Chicago had been a nightmare, and the territory disputes were draining his patience. "Status report," Caelum said to Varric, who stood at attention. "Anything break while I was gone?" "Quiet, Alpha," Varric said smoothly. "Routine patrols. We did have to let go of one of the Omegas, Elara. She was caught stealing and sabotaging the winter meat supply. She's gone south to the city." Caelum frowned. "Elara." He pictured the girl, quiet, always scurrying around the edges of the room like a ghost. Stealing? Sabotage? It didn't fit the scent of fear she always carried, but he was too tired to argue. "Fine, I'm going for a run." "I need to clear my head." Caelum shifted into a massive black wolf and exploded into the snow. He ran hard, letting the burn in his muscles distract him from the stress of leadership. He pushed further north than usual, toward the jagged cliffs. Then disaster struck. The storm of the century hit faster than predicted. In the blinding whiteout, Caelum slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. He tumbled down a ravine, his shoulder slamming into a granite outcrop with a sickening crack. Pain exploded in his vision. He tried to stand, but his front leg gave out. He was miles from the pack house, crippled in a whiteout. Even for an alpha, this was a death sentence. He howled, but the wind tore the sound away. As the cold began to slow his heart, he smelled it. Lavender, pine, and steam. He dragged his broken body toward the scent. He crested a rise and saw a ruin. He collapsed against the wooden door Elara had fashioned, giving one last weak whimper before the darkness took him. Inside the hut, Elara froze. She heard the whimper. She grabbed her hunting knife and cracked the door open. A massive black wolf lay slumped against her wall. "Caelum!" she gasped. Fear spiked in her chest. If she touched him, she was breaking the law. An exiled Omega was forbidden from making contact with the Alpha. If Varric found out, he'd execute her. But then Caelum let out a low, gurgling wheeze. "Screw the law!" Elara hissed. She dropped to her knees. Caelum was massive, weighing easily over 200 pounds. Elara weighed barely 100. She grabbed his scruff and his flank, digging her heels into the mud. "Come on. You are not dying on my property." Slowly, agonizingly, she dragged the Alpha over the threshold. The shift happened almost instantly. The black fur receded, the snout shortened, and within moments, a naked, unconscious, and shivering Caelum lay on her floor. She moved quickly. She dragged him closer to the geothermal pipe. She draped her only heavy coat over him and began to wipe the blood from his face with warm water. She saw the shoulder. It was dislocated. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is going to hurt." She positioned her foot against his ribs for leverage, grabbed his arm, and pulled. Caelum's eyes flew open, glowing a brilliant, terrifying gold. He let out a guttural roar as the joint popped back into place. He swung his good arm out blindly, shoving Elara back against the stone wall. "Who? Where?" He scrambled back. his eyes wild. He expected the storm. He expected death. Instead, he was in a room that smelled of lavender. "You're at the north perimeter," Elara said, rubbing her bruised shoulder. "The old trapper's hut." Caelum looked around, his confusion deepening. "The hut is a ruin. I saw it before I passed out." "It was," Elara said. "I fixed it." Caelum looked at the tarp, the heat-radiating pipe, the scrubbed stones and the drying herbs. He looked at the girl, thin, fragile, yet strong enough to drag a wolf through a blizzard. "Varric told me you left," Caelum said, his voice raspy. "He said you were a thief." "Varric told me I could live here or die in the snow," Elara said simply. "He didn't think I'd last the night." The realization hit Caelum like a physical blow. His beta had attempted to murder a member of his pack. "I need water," he managed. Elara handed him a mug of pine needle tea. "Drink it. It prevents scurvy and boosts the immune system." Caelum drank, his eyes never leaving hers. "Why did you save me? After what my pack did to you, you could have let the snow bury me." "I'm an Omega, Caelum. We nurture. It's not a choice. It's biology. And," she paused, her eyes fierce, "because I'm not a murderer. Unlike your beta." For the next 12 hours, the storm raged. Inside, time suspended. Elara treated Caelum's wounds with yarrow and dandelion root. They spoke in the dim light of the geothermal warmth. She told him about Sloane sabotaging the stove. She told him about the years of being invisible. "I read," she explained as she mended a hole in her sneaker. "The library has old books on herbalism and pioneer survival. Nobody else reads them. I figured if I was going to be invisible, I might as well be smart." Caelum watched her hands. They were rough and scarred, but they moved with a dexterity he admired. He realized he felt safer in this hovel made of trash than he did in his mansion. "This pipe," Caelum said, touching the iron. "You've created a forward operating base. Our patrols freeze on this ridge every winter. You solved a problem my engineers couldn't." "I just wanted to stay warm," she said. When the storm finally broke, Caelum stood up. He was steady, though stiff. "I have to go back. If Varric comes here and sees this, he'll burn it down to hide his crime. You need to stay here. Stay hidden." "You're leaving me here?" Elara asked, a flicker of betrayal in her eyes. "I'm leaving you here because it's the safest place for you while I clean house," Caelum said intensely. He reached out and cupped her chin. "I owe you my life, Elara. The Ridge Pack pays its debts. I'll be back, and next time I'm bringing steak. Rare." He left his Rolex on the floor, a promise of return. Caelum didn't limp into the pack house. He drove a snowmobile he'd commandeered, roaring up the driveway. When he walked into the foyer, still wearing Elara's dirty work coat, Varric's whiskey glass shattered on the floor. "Caelum, we thought you were dead," Varric stammered. "I'm hard to kill, Varric," Caelum said, his voice carrying a terrifying weight. For the next 3 days, Caelum played a dangerous game. He resumed his duties, but he watched. He noticed how the Omegas flinched when Varric walked by. He went to the kitchen and spoke to Mrs. Higgins, the old cook. "It wasn't her, Alpha," the cook wept. "Sloane sabotaged the stove. Varric threatened to cut my pension if I spoke up." Caelum's knuckles turned white. He began to gather his evidence. The second set of books in Varric's safe showing embezzled funds, the testimony of the kitchen staff, and the physical proof of his own attempted abandonment. But Varric wasn't stupid. He noticed Caelum slipping away at night to the north perimeter. He noticed the Alpha's scent changing, smelling of lavender and wood smoke. "He's hiding the girl," Varric whispered to Sloane. "Get the enforcers. We're going to end this tonight." At the hut, Elara heard the warning chimes she had rigged. She grabbed the Glock Caelum had secretly left her on his last visit. Varric's SUV roared into the clearing. "Burn it out," he ordered. A flare pierced the tarp roof. Instantly, the dry pine boughs caught fire. Elara's sanctuary, the place she had built with her blood, was engulfed in flames. Elara didn't freeze. She kicked the door open, hurling a pot of boiling water at the first enforcer. She sprinted toward the woods, leading them into a hidden trench she had dug. Crack! An enforcer screamed as his legs snapped in her trap. But Varric was a beta. He was faster. He caught Elara by the tree line, backhanding her with enough force to lift her off her feet. He dragged her by her hair toward the car. "Tonight," he sneered, "you're the guest of honor at the solstice ball." Miles away, Caelum felt the mate bond snap into place, a phantom pain in his chest as Elara was struck. His eyes turned solid gold. He didn't shift. He ran as a man, his speed fueled by a primal rage. The solstice ball was a sea of velvet and diamonds. The neighboring alphas were all there. Varric marched into the center of the hall, dragging a bruised and bleeding Elara. "Behold," Varric bellowed, "your alpha's secret! He broke the code to harbor this thief." The room gasped. To harbor an exile was political suicide. Varric raised his hand to strike Elara again to prove his dominance. The doors didn't just open. They were shattered. Caelum strode in, covered in the soot of the burning hut. He walked straight to the center of the floor, ignoring the gasps. He took off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over Elara's shoulders. "You're right, Varric," Caelum said, his voice like grinding stones. "I did harbor a wolf in the north, but she isn't a thief. And she isn't an Omega anymore." Caelum turned to the visiting alphas. "I, Caelum of the Iron Ridge, claim Elara as my fated mate, and I challenge Varric for the crime of attempted murder of a Luna." Varric laughed, a frantic, desperate sound. "She's a servant. You'd lose your pack for her? I'd burn the world for her." Caelum whispered. The fight was short. Caelum didn't just win, he dismantled Varric. He threw the embezzled records at the feet of the council. He revealed the truth of the burnt meat and the stolen supplies. "Varric," Caelum said, standing over the broken beta, "I sentence you to the north perimeter. No hut, no pipe, just the cold you thought she couldn't survive." As the guards dragged Varric away, the room was silent. Caelum turned to Elara. He bowed his head, the Alpha bowing to the Omega. "The hut is gone," he murmured, wiping blood from her lip. Elara looked at the luxury of the hall, then back at him. "The hut was just wood, Caelum. The sanctuary is right here." She placed her hand over his heart. From that day forward, the Iron Ridge changed. The geothermal springs were tapped to heat the entire village. The Omega rank was abolished, replaced by a meritocracy based on the very endurance Elara had shown. Elara didn't just become a Luna. She became the architect of a new world. She proved that your worth isn't decided by the rank you were born into, but by the fire you carry within. Elara's journey from a freezing ruin to the throne of the Iron Ridge is a reminder that the world can take your home, but it can never take your resilience. Join the pack. If you enjoyed this tale of survival, betrayal, and ultimate justice, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that the Iron Ridge is rising. Never miss a chapter. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have new werewolf dramas dropping every day that will leave you howling for more. Join the debate. What would you have done? Would you have saved the Alpha who ignored you, or let him freeze? Comment below. I reply to the most creative survival strategies. Share the fire. Know someone going through their own winter? Share this story with them. Remind them that some wolves aren't just born, they are forged.